The chronicler, as the author is known, has greatly compressed the early events of the monarchy. The stories from 1 and 2 Samuel must have been well enough known that he could be very selective. This often makes it more important to consider why he has included this, dropped that, and added the other. As we saw in chapter 10, Saul's story is reduced to just a few verses, and the narrative joins him at his moment of destruction. The chronicler does not seem interested in the grand narrative that built up from Genesis to 1 Samuel, from the promises to the patriarchs, the Exodus, the wandering in the desert, capturing and settling in the land, and the highs and lows of the period of the Judges, at the end of which the people of Israel clamoured for a king. Not that that history was unimportant to him, but the chronicler instead seems to want to focus on Jerusalem and what makes Jerusalem important, which is God's choice of David and God's choice of Jerusalem to install his temple. As it is to Jerusalem that the exiles have returned, this makes this emphasis more comprehensible. Other compressions reveal the chronicler's emphases. The struggles between Saul and David and the tricky politics between David and the other tribes are all redacted here. If you didn't know the full history from 1 Chronicles, you would think that the transition from Saul to David was smooth, happening pretty much overnight, and had the unanimous support of everyone. It seems as though the chronicler wants to emphasize the unity which David brought with his reign, even if in reality it was not so immediately gained. The other emphasis is on the recognition of God's election of David. The tribes acknowledge the rightness of David's rule, which follows from the concluding statement of chapter 10, which states that God put Saul to death and turned the kingdom over to David. 2 Samuel begins with the news of Saul and Jonathan's death reaching David. Chapter 2 sees him going up to Hebron, which was south of Jerusalem, where the men of Judah proclaimed him king, and where he reigned for 7 years and 6 months. A rival king is also proclaimed, Ishbaal, son of Saul. Chapter 3 begins by saying there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, where Saul's house grew weaker, but David's grew stronger. The struggle goes on until the end of chapter 4. All of this is deleted by the chronicler, who begins from 2 Samuel 5. The impression he creates is that David is at Hebron when Saul dies, and all Israel comes straight to him and proclaims him king. There is no hint of a power struggle or of a delay of the tribes coming round to support him. But this anointing, the chronicler notes, fulfills the word of Samuel, a story which he has not told, so he assumes you know. Chapter 11 is based on 2 Samuel with some alterations. Following David's anointing over all Israel, he marches to Jerusalem and captures it, renaming it the City of David. The chronicler duly follows this order of narrative, but whereas 2 Samuel 5 focuses on David's actions, the chronicler gives the credit to Joab, who is also mentioned as doing building work. His taking up of the challenge to capture Jerusalem is given as the reason why he became commander of the army. The City of David was called thus because he lived there, and not, as in 2 Samuel 5, because he gave it that name. This again points to the unity of the public recognition of David's status. The lists of the mighty men and their stories of valour serve to honour David as being worthy of their admiration and loyalty. The wonderful story where he refuses to the water which is brought to him is repeated here, moved by the chronicler to the beginning of David's story, whereas it is part of the appendix to 2 Samuel. Chapter 12 contains new material and so is not based on 2 Samuel. It begins by going back in time slightly and makes reference to the trouble that David had because of Saul. This is not long before Saul's death, when David served the Philistine king Achish, who had given him the city Ziklag, which is to where these warriors now come. But from verse 8, there is another backwards time shift, as the stronghold now referred to is in the wilderness near Adullam, which takes us all the way back to the beginning of 1 Samuel 22, though it has also been referred to in the story beginning at 11:15. The chronicler is going backwards in time from the point when Israel united to proclaim David king in Hebron, to show that the warriors from various tribes had already joined at different points in the past, even breaking away from their fellow tribesmen in the support of Saul, as seems to be the case for the Gadites and is, of course, for the Benjamites. In verse 17, with an invocation of God, David challenges the intentions of the approaching Benjamites and Judahites. The Spirit now clothes or seizes or comes upon Amasai, who promises peace, offers loyalty and service, and acknowledges that God has chosen David. Amasai is not part of the prophetic guild, but this is a recurring feature of Chronicles, where ordinary people are clothed for a moment with the Spirit and given some prophetic utterance. It is also noteworthy that Benjaminites and Judahites were, with the Levites, at the core of the community of those returned from exile, and this significant moment is therefore appealing. At verse 38, we are back to where we started in chapter 11, which is not quite the present, having now listed all the warriors who were at Hebron for the anointing and a huge feast. The chronicler emphasizes that all Israel were of one mind in proclaiming David as king. He concludes in verse 40 by saying there was joy in Israel, another theme for the chronicler, who emphasizes the joy and therefore the rightness of David, Jerusalem, and the temple, especially in contrast with the illegitimate northern cult. Although the chronicler has compressed David's narrative, he does significantly enhance David's preparations and provisions for the future temple and its services. Thus, he is seen to have had a much greater hand in the setting up of the proper worship of the Lord for all Israel. Appropriately enough, the next thing David attempts is to retrieve the ark.